What happens when a perfect fairy tale shatters in the most public way imaginable? We see the lives of the ultra-rich as a fantasy. Glittering galas, endless wealth, a love story for the ages. Julian Croft, the tech billionaire, and his radiant, pregnant wife, Isabella, were the world's golden couple. What can make a man who has everything risk it all with one swing of his hand? The answer is far more shocking than you could ever imagine. The air in the grand ballroom of the Savoy was thick with the scent of money and lilies. It was the annual Starlight Children's Foundation Gala, the glittering apex of London's philanthropic calendar. And at the heart of it all, holding court without a throne, were Julian and Isabella Croft. Julian Croft was a man sculpted from ambition and success. At 35, his company, Nexus Dynamics, had revolutionized renewable energy, making him not just a billionaire, but a visionary. He had sharp, intelligent eyes, a jawline that seemed carved from granite, and a smile that could disarm world leaders and secure billion-dollar deals. Tonight, he was immaculate in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo. Beside him, a perfect counterpart, was his wife, Isabella. She was beauty and grace personified, a former art curator whose quiet intelligence was often overshadowed by her stunning looks. Tonight, she wore a flowing emerald gown of silk chiffon that elegantly draped over her 5-month pregnancy. The gentle swell of her belly was a public declaration of their shared future, the next chapter in their celebrated love story. Her dark hair was swept up, showcasing a cascade of diamond earrings, a recent gift from Julian. To the outside world, they were flawless. He, the titan of industry; she, his elegant, adored muse. The cameras adored them. The gossip columnists revered them. Their life was a curated masterpiece of polo matches, yachting in Monaco, and romantic getaways that filled the pages of lifestyle magazines. But a masterpiece can have cracks invisible to the naked eye. As the evening wore on, a subtle tension began to coil around their table. Julian's smile, usually so effortless, seemed bolted in place. His hand, when he placed it on Isabella's back, was less a caress and more an act of possession. His fingers were just a little too tight. "Are you all right, darling?" Isabella murmured, her voice a soft melody against the din of the orchestra. She placed her hand over his. It was cold. Julian's eyes didn't meet hers. They were scanning the room, flitting from face to face with a paranoid intensity. "I'm fine," he clipped his jaw tight, "just enjoying the evening." But he wasn't. For the past 2 weeks, a poison had been seeping into his mind, drop by insidious drop. It had started with an anonymous email, then a misdelivered private investigator's report to his office filled with grainy photos of Isabella having lunch with a male friend, an old university colleague. Benign, yet the accompanying text was venomous. "Does she look like a woman carrying your child, or someone hiding a secret?" The architect of this poison was a man named Damien Thorne. A ruthless business rival Julian had bested in a hostile takeover 2 years prior. Thorne had been publicly humiliated and financially wounded. He had vowed revenge, but Julian, arrogant in his success, had dismissed the threat. He never imagined the revenge would be so intimate, so personally destructive. Thorne had spent a year meticulously planting seeds of doubt, using proxies and anonymous channels to feed Julian's deepest insecurity, that he wasn't worthy of a love as pure as Isabella's seemed to be. Tonight, the poison was reaching its peak. Damien Thorne was here, at a table across the ballroom, watching with a predator's patience. A few minutes earlier, he had approached Julian at the bar, a condolent look on his face. "Julian, my friend," Thorne had said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "I hope whatever is troubling you and Isabella passes. A beautiful family like yours. It would be a tragedy to see it broken by misunderstandings." He let the word hang in the air, a veiled threat wrapped in concern. Now, back at his table, Julian watched as Isabella laughed at something a guest said. It was a beautiful sound, but in his corrupted mind, it sounded like a betrayal. The PI report had mentioned her easy laughter with her friend. Was she laughing at him? Was this whole perfect life a charade? The final speaker of the night, the Foundation's director, took to the stage. He began to speak about the importance of family, of protecting the innocent, of building a safe future for children. Each word was a hammer blow to Julian's fractured psyche. And now, the director announced, we'd like to honor a couple who have been our most generous benefactors, a true example of love and partnership. Please join me in a round of applause for Mr. Julian and Mrs. Isabella Croft. A spotlight flooded their table. The room erupted in applause. This was the moment they were supposed to stand, wave, and embody the fairy tale. Isabella turned to Julian, her face alight with a genuine, proud smile. The love in her eyes was unmistakable, a beacon in the storm of his paranoia. Julian, they're honoring us. Isn't it wonderful? She reached for his hand. In that moment, her pure, unsuspecting joy was the final trigger. To his sickened mind, it was the ultimate act of deception. The gall of her to look so innocent while, in his mind, she was carrying another man's child and making a fool of him in front of the world that worshipped him. He stood up. Isabella started to rise with him, her smile still radiant. "Don't touch me," he snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl that only she could hear. Her smile faltered. Confusion clouded her beautiful features. "Julian, what's wrong?" she whispered, her hand still outstretched. He looked from her hand to her face, to the gentle curve of her stomach. The future he had so desperately wanted, now a symbol of his humiliation. The applause continued, a deafening soundtrack to his private hell. Damien Thorne was watching, a faint, triumphant smirk on his lips. It was all too much, the pressure, the paranoia, the public adoration that now felt like mockery. In one swift, horrific motion, Julian's carefully constructed world imploded. He drew his hand back and slapped her. The sound was sharp, ugly, and absolute. It cut through the applause like a guillotine. A collective gasp, a tidal wave of shock, swept across the grand ballroom. The orchestra faltered, a violin screeching into silence. Every phone, every camera, every eye was locked on them. Isabella stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek. Not from pain, which would come later, but in sheer, unadulterated shock. The stinging on her skin was nothing compared to the shattering of her heart. Tears welled instantly, not of sadness, but of disbelief. The man she loved, the father of her child, had just struck her in front of the entire world. For a frozen second, there was only the tableau. The billionaire, his hands still half raised, his face a mask of rage and instant regret. The beautiful pregnant wife, her world destroyed, and the silent, watching crowd. Then the silence broke. The silence that followed the slap lasted only 3 seconds, but within that void, an entire empire began to crumble. It was a silence filled with the frantic clicking of camera shutters and the horrified, indrawn breaths of hundreds of people. Then came the roar. It wasn't a cheer, it was a wave of collective revulsion. The first voice to cut through was a woman's sharp cry from a nearby table. "You monster!" Suddenly, the spell was broken. The room, once a sea of polite smiles and quiet murmurs, erupted into a cacophony of outrage. Phones, which moments before were discreetly tucked away, were now held aloft, their small red recording lights blinking like 100 angry eyes. The live stream of the gala, meant to capture philanthropy in action, was now broadcasting a billionaire's downfall in high definition. Julian stood frozen, the tingling in his palm a horrifying echo of his action. The red haze of his rage evaporated as quickly as it had descended, replaced by a chilling, gut-wrenching clarity. What had he done? He looked at Isabella, truly looked at her for the first time in weeks. Past the veil of his suspicion, he saw not a deceiver, but the woman he had vowed to protect, her eyes wide with a pain so deep it seemed to suck the air from his own lungs. Her hand was still on her cheek, her body trembling. Before he could utter a word, a figure moved with purpose from the table next to theirs. It was Beatrice Alastair, a formidable woman in her late 60s with silver hair styled in an elegant chignon and a reputation for philanthropy matched only by her sharp tongue. She was old money, a matriarch of London society who feared no one, least of all a new money tech mogul having a breakdown. Ignoring Julian completely, as if he were a piece of furniture, Mrs. Alastair wrapped a steadying arm around Isabella's shoulders. "Come, my dear," she said, her voice firm but kind, a rock in the swirling chaos. "You will not stand here for one more second." Isabella, seemingly in a trance, allowed herself to be guided away. As she passed Julian, she didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of dignity. That lack of acknowledgement was more cutting than any scream or accusation could have ever been. He had ceased to exist for her. Julian reached out, a desperate, reflexive gesture. "I say wait." His words were swallowed by the rising tide of condemnation. "Shame on you," another guest shouted. In front of everyone, a man yelled. The security detail, initially paralyzed by the profile of the individuals involved, now began to move, forming a clumsy barrier around Julian as reporters, freed from the constraints of polite society, surged forward. "Mr. Croft, why did you hit your wife? Is there trouble in the marriage? Is the baby okay?" The questions were like shrapnel. He staggered back, his mind unable to process the cacophony. His eyes darted across the room and locked with Damien Thorne's. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of performative, grave concern. Thorne even shook his head slightly, as if to say, "What a tragedy." He was already playing his next move, distancing himself, becoming a concerned bystander to the demolition he had engineered. Julian's security team, led by a stoic man named Marcus, finally managed to hustle him toward his service exit. The walk was a gauntlet of pure hatred. People who had shaken his hand an hour ago now stared at him with contempt. They didn't step aside. They forced his security to carve a path through their disgust. As he was bundled into the dark corridor behind the kitchens, the last thing he heard from the ballroom was Mrs. Alastair's voice ringing with authority, directed at the gawking crowd. "Give the woman some dignity. All of you, put your phones away this instant." In a quiet, private suite on the hotel's 5th floor, secured by Mrs. Alastair's influence, Isabella sat on the edge of a silk-covered bed. A hotel doctor had just finished checking her vitals, reassuring her that physically, both she and the baby were unharmed. The red mark on her cheek was already beginning to fade. The invisible wounds, however, were catastrophic. Mrs. Alastair dismissed the doctor with a grateful nod and sat beside her, handing her a glass of water. "Drink this, child." Isabella's hands were shaking too much to hold the glass. Mrs. Alastair held it to her lips for her. For a long time, Isabella said nothing. She just stared at the intricate pattern on the Persian rug, her mind a white out of shock. The public humiliation was a burning fire, but beneath it was the icy core of betrayal. The man who had recited poetry to her under the stars in Tuscany. The man who had cried with joy when she told him she was pregnant. The man whose child was moving inside her at this very moment. That man had looked at her with pure hatred and struck her. "It wasn't him," she finally whispered. Mrs. Alastair raised a skeptical eyebrow. "My dear, I saw it with my own eyes. The whole world saw it." "No," Isabella insisted, a flicker of her old strength returning. She looked up, her gaze clear and intense despite the tears. "I mean, that man in the ballroom was not my husband. Not the man I married. Something is wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong." She had seen glimpses of it for weeks. The paranoia, the sleepless nights, the sudden sharp questions about her past. He had become distant, suspicious, a ghost haunting their perfect home. She had tried to talk to him, but he had pushed her away, retreating further into a fortress of dark thoughts. She had assumed it was the pressure of a new acquisition his company was making. She had never, in her wildest nightmares, imagined this. "He's been manipulated," Isabella said, the conviction growing in her voice. "Someone has been poisoning him against me." Her mind, sharp and analytical from her years as a curator piecing together the history of art, began to work. She thought of the strange occurrences, the veiled comments, and then a name surfaced in her memory: Damien Thorne. She remembered Julian mentioning his strangely solicitous behavior recently. She remembered the look on Thorne's face at a board meeting she'd attended months ago, a look of cold, calculating hatred directed at Julian. Downstairs, Julian was finally bundled into the back of his Rolls-Royce Phantom. The car was immediately swarmed by paparazzi who had been alerted. The flashbulbs were relentless, a blinding, predatory storm. Inside the silent, leather-clad cocoon of the car, Julian slumped against the seat, head in his hands. His phone was vibrating incessantly. A frantic text from his head of PR, viral. Croft slap, trending one worldwide. Stock futures in free fall. Call me now. He ignored it. All he could see was Isabella's face. The shock, the hurt, the utter destruction of her trust in him. The poison that Damien Thorne had poured into his ear now seemed like a pathetic, flimsy excuse for an act of unforgivable brutality. He hadn't been a manipulated man. He had been a weak one. He had allowed his own insecurities to be weaponized against the person he loved most. He had flown too close to the sun and, in a moment of mad pride, had melted his own wings. But he hadn't just fallen. He had dragged his pregnant wife and his unborn child down into the fire with him. The crowd had turned against him instantly. But the most damning judgment had been in Isabella's eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that winning back the world approval would be nothing compared to the impossible task of winning back hers. The 24 hours that followed the slap were not a news cycle. They were a global maelstrom. By dawn, Julian Croft was no longer a visionary billionaire. He was a meme, a villain, a hashtag. His face, contorted in rage, was juxtaposed against Isabella's look of stunned betrayal on every major news network from CNN to the BBC. The headline in The Sun was simple and brutal: The Beast and the Beauty. Nexus Dynamics, the empire Julian had built from nothing, was an empire of glass, and the world was now throwing stones. By the time the London Stock Exchange opened at 8 a.m., its stock had entered a free fall so catastrophic it triggered automatic trading halts. Investors weren't just nervous, they were morally repulsed. The company's board of directors, a collection of powerful figures who had once idolized Julian, convened an emergency meeting without him. The agenda had only one item, Clause 7 of his contract, the morality clause. Holed up in his sterile, minimalist penthouse overlooking the Thames, Julian was a king in a kingdom of one. He hadn't slept. He had watched the news until the repetition of his own monstrous image made him physically sick. He had showered 3 times, trying to scrub the phantom feeling of the slap from his skin. Marcus, his head of security, stood by the vast floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to his ear, taking in a relentless stream of bad news. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual deference. "The board has voted. They're invoking the morality clause. They've requested your immediate and indefinite leave of absence. The press release is scheduled for noon." Julian didn't react. He was staring at a framed photo on his desk. It was of him and Isabella in Santorini, taken a year ago. She was laughing, her head thrown back, the setting sun catching the gold in her hair. He had been so sure then of his own goodness, reflected in her eyes. "And Mrs. Croft?" Julian asked, his voice a rasp. "She remains at the Savoy, sir, in the royal suite. Mrs. Alastair has arranged for her own private security. My calls to her team have been rebuffed. They have made it clear that any attempt by you to approach or contact her will be met with a restraining order." Each word was a nail in his coffin. He was being surgically excised from his own life. His personal phone buzzed. It was his mother, a formidable woman calling from their family estate in the Cotswolds. He answered. "Julian," she began, her voice devoid of warmth. "I have just seen your father, a man who has never shown a moment of weakness in his 70 years, and he was weeping, not with anger, but with shame. Whatever you have become, it is not the son we raised." The line went dead. The weight of it all finally broke him. He swept his arm across his desk, sending the photo, his laptop, everything crashing to the floor. He sank into his chair, a strangled sob escaping his lips. This was the true consequence. Not the money, not the company, but the severing of every bond of love and respect he had ever known. In the quiet luxury of the royal suite, Isabella was mounting a different kind of response. The initial shock had receded, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed resolve. She was not a victim to be pitied. She was a woman who had been wronged, and she needed to understand why. With the formidable Beatrice Alastair by her side, orchestrating a protective shield around her, Isabella began to piece together the puzzle. Damien Thorne, Isabella said again, more certain this time. He has to be behind this. Julian would never. She trailed off. He had, but he had been pushed. Beatrice, using her vast network, made a few discreet calls. Within hours, a picture began to emerge. A whisper from a disgruntled former employee of Thorne's. A tip from a financial journalist who had been tracking Thorne's unusual short positions against Nexus Dynamics stock, placed a week before the gala. He wasn't just planning for a downfall. He was betting on it. The most crucial piece of information came from a junior IT technician at Nexus Dynamics, a young woman whom Isabella had once mentored when she visited the office. Terrified of losing her job, but fiercely loyal to Isabella, the technician called a private number Beatrice had provided. "Mrs. Croft," she whispered, "there's something you need to know. For the last month, Mr. Croft's private server has been compromised. A series of encrypted files were uploaded from external source. They were designed to look like they came from a private investigator's office in another country. I saw the logs. They were untraceable, ghost-like. But the source IP, just for a millisecond before it was masked, pinged back to a holding company. A company owned by Thorne Industries." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. What was in the files? The technician hesitated. "I only saw a file name before the system locked me out. It was Project Nightingale." Project Nightingale. It meant nothing to her, but it was a thread, and she pulled on it. Meanwhile, she knew the world was watching, waiting for her to speak. Her silence was being interpreted as weakness, the silent suffering of a battered wife. She needed to reclaim her own story. She turned to Beatrice. "I won't be a victim in his story or in Damien Thorne's. I need to speak, not to a tabloid, but to someone serious, someone who deals in facts, not sensationalism." Beatrice nodded, already scrolling through her contacts. "I know just the person, Clara Vance. Her interviews are legendary. She's tough, fair, and she can't be bought." Across London, in his opulent Mayfair office, Damien Thorne was celebrating. He poured 2 glasses of vintage Macallan whiskey and handed one to a man sitting in the shadows. To project Nightingale, Damien toasted, his eyes glittering with triumph. More successful than I ever could have imagined. He didn't just crumble. He detonated. The man in the shadows, a disgraced geneticist named Dr. Eris Thorne, Damien's distant, debt-ridden cousin, took a nervous sip. The files were convincing, then. The fabricated DNA report. Damien laughed, a low, cruel sound. "Julian has one great weakness, Eris' pride. All I had to do was suggest that his perfect wife, his perfect life, was a lie. That the child he so desperately wanted wasn't his. I gave him a file showing a 99.9% probability that the fetus was related to Isabella's old university friend. Your work was very persuasive." Dr. Thorne shifted uncomfortably. "It was falsified data, Damien. A complete fabrication. If anyone ever investigates." "Who will investigate?" Damien scoffed. "Julian is a pariah. Isabella is a broken woman. By the time the dust settles, I will have absorbed the remnants of Nexus Dynamics, and he will have nothing. He took my company, so I took his life. An eye for an eye." He stared out the window at the gleaming towers of the city. He hadn't just won a business deal. He had authored a Greek tragedy, and he, the villain, was the only one left standing to enjoy the view. He was sure of it. He had accounted for Julian's pride and Isabella's love. He had not, however, accounted for her strength. Clara Vance was a journalist who moved with the quiet lethality of a panther. She didn't chase stories. Stories came to her, drawn by her reputation for unearthing the truth with surgical precision. When she received the call from Beatrice Alastair, she canceled a scheduled interview with a cabinet minister. This was the real story. The interview was not set in a sterile television studio. At Isabella's request, it took place in the library of Mrs. Alastair's Belgravia townhouse. The room was filled with old books and the quiet dignity of history, a deliberate choice to contrast with the garish, modern chaos of the scandal. Isabella wore a simple cream cashmere dress. She was composed, her voice steady. There were no theatrics, no crocodile tears. There was only a woman determined to set the record straight. Clara began her questions, gentle but probing. Isabella, the world saw an act of violence. What do you want the world to know now? Isabella looked directly into the camera. I want them to know that what they saw was not an act of domestic abuse in the way they understand it. It was the final, tragic symptom of a sophisticated and cruel psychological attack against my husband, and by extension, against me and our unborn child. The directness of the statement caught Clara off guard. Are you saying Julian Croft is the victim here? Julian is responsible for his actions, Isabella stated, her voice firm. He raised his hand to me. That is something we will have to live with forever. It is a wound that may never heal. But he was not the sole architect of that moment. He was a puppet, and his strings were being pulled by a man named Damien Thorne. Over the next hour, Isabella, with Clara's expert guidance, laid out the facts. She spoke of Project Nightingale. She mentioned the compromised server, the tip from the loyal IT technician. She didn't have all the pieces, but she had enough to paint a damning picture of corporate espionage bleeding into personal warfare. But then came the moment that would change everything. There's one more thing, Isabella said, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. The foundation of this attack, I believe, was a lie about my baby. A lie designed to make my husband believe this child was not his. Clara leaned forward. And is it? Isabella looked into the camera again, her eyes unwavering. When Julian and I decided to have a child, we faced some difficulties. We used IVF to conceive. It was a private, deeply personal journey for us. She took a breath. As part of that process, our DNA, our genetic markers, are all on file at the most reputable fertility clinic in the country, the Lister Hospital. They are irrefutable. She slid a sealed envelope across the table to Clara. That is a certified copy of the prenatal genetic report conducted 3 days ago. It confirms with 100% certainty that Julian Croft is the father of my child. The lie, whatever form it took, was a fabrication, and I am willing to have any independent doctor in the world verify it. This was the bombshell, not just a denial, but a scientifically proven refutation of the unspoken rumor that now hung over the scandal. The interview aired that evening. It didn't just change the narrative, it torched it. The public, so quick to condemn, was now faced with a far more complex and sinister story. The hashtag Croft Slap was slowly being replaced by Project Nightingale and Damien Thorne. In his penthouse, Julian watched the interview transfixed. He saw Isabella, not broken and weeping, but strong, intelligent, and fiercely protective of their child off his child. He heard about the IVF, a secret they had kept so close, now laid bare to defend him. He heard about the compromised server, the fabricated lie about paternity. The paranoia that had encased him like a shroud was ripped away, and the truth was blinding. He wasn't a righteous man betrayed. He was a fool, a prize champion fool who had performed his trick for the whole world to see. He thought back to every conversation with Damien, every friendly warning, every piece of evidence. It was all so clear now. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. The name Project Nightingale echoed in his mind. It was a name from his past. Years ago, in his first major business venture, he had outmaneuvered Damien Thorne to acquire a small but brilliant biotech firm. The firm's signature research project, a revolutionary gene sequencing technique, was codenamed Nightingale. Thorne had never forgiven him for it. This wasn't just revenge. It was poetry. Thorne had used the ghost of their first battle to win the last one. A fire Julian hadn't felt in years ignited in his gut. It wasn't the blind rage from the gala. It was a cold, focused fury. He had been played. His wife had been endangered, and his child had been used as a weapon. He picked up his phone and called the one man he knew was still loyal, the one man who operated in the shadows better than anyone. "Marcus," Julian said, his voice deadly calm. "Cancel my leave of absence. We're going to work. I want you to find a man, a geneticist named Dr. Eris Thorne. Find out everything about him, his debts, his vices, his fears. And I want you to arrange a meeting for me with Damien Thorne. Not an office. Somewhere he can't escape. Damien Thorne watched the interview from his own home, the Macallan glass frozen halfway to his lips. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. Isabella was supposed to disappear, a tragic footnote. She wasn't supposed to fight back with facts and evidence. His phone rang. It was his cousin, Eris, his voice trembling with panic. They know, Damien. They're talking about a fabrication. The Lister Hospital, their records are ironclad. We're ruined. Calm down, you fool. Damien hissed, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. She has no proof connecting us to anything. It's her word against a ghost on the internet. Hold your nerve. But he knew it was too late. Isabella hadn't just cleared her name. She had given the world a new villain. And as the interview concluded with Clara Vance looking gravely at the camera and saying, "The question now is not what happened at the gala, but how far Damien Thorne was willing to go," he felt the first real tremor of fear. He had built a perfect trap for Julian Croft. He had just never considered that the bait might be the one to tear it all apart. Julian Croft had always understood that true power wasn't about shouting. It was about controlling the environment. For his confrontation with Damien Thorne, he chose the sky. The London Eye on a gray, drizzly weekday afternoon was nearly deserted. Marcus had booked an entire pod, citing a private corporate event. As the colossal wheel began its slow, silent ascent, the sprawling panorama of London unfolded below, a city that had witnessed both Julian's meteoric rise and his spectacular fall. Damien Thorne stepped into the pod just as the doors were closing, a look of weary curiosity on his face. He had come because the invitation was irresistible, a summons from a ghost. He expected to see a broken man. The man standing by the curved glass was not broken. Julian Croft was terrifyingly calm. The wild, emotional rage of the gala was gone, replaced by an arctic stillness that was far more intimidating. "Julian," Damien began, adopting his familiar tone of faux concern. "I was horrified when I heard. If there's anything I can do." "Save it, Damien." Julian cut him off, his voice low and even. He didn't turn to face him yet, continuing to gaze out at the city. "Let's talk about Project Nightingale." The name hit Damien like a physical blow. He stiffened, his carefully composed mask twitching. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Julian finally turned, his eyes locking onto Damien's. "It was a good name, poetic. A callback to the first time I beat you. The first time I took something you thought was yours. You've been nursing that grudge for a decade, haven't you?" The pod reached its apex, 135 meters above the ground. Below, the world looked like a map. They were suspended between the heavens and the earth in a glass bubble of truth. "You found my weakness," Julian continued, taking a slow step forward. "It wasn't money or power. It was pride. The fear that I wasn't good enough, that the life I had was too perfect, that I didn't deserve Isabella. And you played on it, like a virtuoso." Damien's facade began to crack. "You're delusional. Grief has clearly scrambled your mind." "My mind is clearer than it has ever been," Julian countered. "Let me tell you what I see. I see a man so consumed by envy that he decided to destroy a life rather than build his own. You couldn't beat me in the boardroom, so you crept in my home, into my marriage, into my head." He took another step. The pod was not large. There was nowhere for Damien to retreat. "You hired your cousin, Dr. Eris Thorne," Julian stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "A geneticist with a gambling problem and a mountain of debt. 100,000 pounds, was it? To falsify a DNA report. To make me believe my own child was a stranger growing inside the woman I love." Damien's face went pale. "You have no proof." "Proof?" A small, cold smile touched Julian's lips. "Proof is for courts. This is for me. Marcus found your cousin an hour ago at Luton Airport trying to board a one-way flight to Macau. Dr. Thorne has a terrible fear of heights and enclosed spaces. He's a very talkative man when he's uncomfortable. He kept a copy of all your correspondence, by the way. An insurance policy. He signed a full confession half an hour ago." The last of Damien's composure shattered. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, terrified sheen. You can't prove anything in court. It's inadmissible. I don't need a court, Damien, Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You wanted to see my empire fall. Well, you succeeded. My stock is in the gutter. The board has ousted me. My name is synonymous with disgrace. I have nothing left to lose. He gestured to the glass floor of the pod. We're a long way up. Accidents happen. A scuffle between two distraught business rivals. A tragic fall. The media would love that story, wouldn't they? It has a certain symmetry. Terror, pure and primal, flashed in Damien's eyes. He finally saw the man in front of him, not as the disgraced fool from the gala, but as a predator who had been stripped of everything but his rage. He stumbled backward, pressing himself against the far side of the pod. You're insane, he stammered. You made me this way, Julian said, his voice laced with cold fury. You turned my love into a weapon against me. You threatened my child. My wife had to go on international television and discuss the intimate details of our life just to undo the damage you caused. You didn't just attack my business. You defiled my family. Julian stood inches from him now. The silence in the pod was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the machinery and Damien's ragged breathing. Julian raised his hand, the same hand that had struck Isabella. Damien flinched violently, cowering like a dog. But Julian didn't strike him. He simply let his hand hang in the air for a moment before slowly lowering it. Beating you would be a release, Julian said, his voice filled with contempt. And you don't deserve one. Your punishment won't be a moment of pain. It will be a lifetime of it. The confession, the evidence. It's already been sent to the Serious Fraud Office, the Financial Conduct Authority, and every major news outlet on the planet. Your assets will be frozen by morning. Your reputation will be incinerated. Every friend you have will desert you. You'll be the pariah. You'll be me, but without the slightest chance of redemption. The pod began its descent, the view of London rushing back into focus. Your revenge was a masterpiece of destruction. Damien, I'll give you that, Julian said, stepping back and turning to watch the city reappear. But you forgot one thing. When you burn a man's entire world down, you've got to make sure he's in it. All you did was clear the land for me to build something new. Now get out of my sight. As the pod doors opened with a gentle hiss, Marcus was waiting. Damien Thorne, a man who had walked in radiating arrogance, stumbled out a ghost in a 1,000-pound suit. He didn't look at Julian. He walked, zombie-like, into the arms of two plain-clothed police officers who were waiting for him just beyond the barriers. Julian watched him go, feeling not satisfaction, but a profound emptiness. He had won the war, but the battle that truly mattered was yet to come. He had to face Isabella. The chosen location was a world away from the cold marble of courtrooms and the sterile glass of corporate offices. Julian met her in the Princess of Wales Conservatory at Kew Gardens. Outside, a typically gray and melancholic London sky wept a fine drizzle onto the manicured lawns. But inside the glass house, it was another world. The air was warm, thick, and alive with the humid scent of damp earth, exotic blossoms, and slow, patient growth. It was Isabella's choice, a neutral territory, a place of life to confront the death of their trust. Julian walked through the glass doors connecting the dry, arid zone to the tropical orchid display where she was waiting. The shift in atmosphere was immediate and suffocating. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the serene quiet of the conservatory. He had faced down hostile boards, ruthless competitors, and a global media firestorm. But that was all armor and artifice. This was different. This required a nakedness of the soul he wasn't sure he possessed. He saw her standing by a display of Phalaenopsis orchids, their delicate, moth-like petals a stark white against the lush green foliage. She wasn't looking at him, but at the flowers, her profile silhouetted against the bright, diffused light of the glass panes. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress that did little to conceal the prominent, beautiful curve of her pregnancy. Her hair was pulled back simply, and she wore no jewelry. There was a stillness about her, a formidable serenity that was entirely new. The fragile, Heartbroken woman from the Savoy was gone. In her place stood a queen in exile, surveying the ruins of her kingdom with a sorrowful but unbreakable resolve. He stopped a dozen feet away, the distance feeling like an impassable chasm. Every rehearsed apology, every carefully constructed sentence he had prepared, evaporated into the humid air. All that was left was the horrifyingly simple truth of his failure. "I he began, his voice a dry, unfamiliar rasp. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet space. She turned slowly. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of the woman he had danced with in Tuscany, the woman whose laughter was his favorite sound. But it was immediately guarded, replaced by a calm, appraising look. It was the look of someone studying a historical artifact, trying to understand how something so precious could have been so thoroughly broken. There was no hatred in her eyes, which was somehow worse. Hatred was a fire you could fight. This was a deep, glacial sadness. "I know," he started again, forcing the words out. "I know that the word sorry is an insult to what I did. It's a word for spilling coffee, not for shattering a life. My life, your life, ours." He took a hesitant step forward, his hands clenched at his sides to stop them from shaking. "There is no excuse. I want you to hear that. There are reassances sickness in my own mind, a poison poured by another man. But there is no excuse. Damien Thorne didn't raise his hand to you. My pride did. My insecurity did. I did. I looked at you, the purest thing in my life, and I chose to believe a lie fabricated by the ugliest parts of the world. I chose to believe it over the evidence of every day I ever spent with you. That is my sin and mine alone." He let the confession hang in the air, heavy and absolute. He didn't beg, didn't plead for understanding. He simply stated the truth of his guilt. Isabella listened, her expression unreadable. She walked slowly from the orchids to a simple wooden bench and sat down, her hand resting protectively on the swell of her belly. She looked at him for a long, silent moment before she spoke, her voice as quiet as the drizzle outside. "Do you know what the worst part was, Julian?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a profound tremor of memory. "It wasn't the slap itself. The sting on my cheek was gone in an hour. The humiliation. That was a firestorm, but fires eventually burn out. The worst part, the part that plays in my mind when I try to sleep, was the 2 seconds before. It was the look in your eyes. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. I looked at my husband, the father of the child, moving inside me, and I saw a stranger. I saw a look of pure, undiluted hatred. You looked at me, at this baby, as if we were a contamination, a disease you needed to violently expel from your perfect life. In that moment, you didn't just hit me. You erased me. You erased everything we had ever been. How do I ever unsee that? How does our child grow up knowing his father was capable of looking at his mother that way?" Her questions weren't attacks. They were genuine points of inquiry from a soul in agony, and they pierced him more deeply than any shout could have. "You can't," he whispered, the admission tearing at his throat. "You can never unsee it, and I will spend every remaining day of my life trying to prove that the man you saw in that moment is dead. I killed him, because if I don't, then I have no right to even breathe the same air as you and our child." He walked to the bench opposite hers and placed a thick, leather-bound folder on it. The sound of it landing was definitive. "I came here today not to ask for forgiveness. I have no right to it. I came to begin my atonement." He pushed the folder across the table. "This is a legal transfer, ratified this morning. Half of my entire personal fortune, everything that wasn't tied up in Nexus dynamics, has been placed into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiaries are you and our child. It is yours, untouchable by me, by the company, by anyone. It is security. It is freedom. It is a pathetic attempt to repair a fissure in the universe, but it's the only tool I have." He then slid a single sheet of paper from his jacket pocket. It was his formal, undated resignation as CEO of Nexus Dynamics. "The board wants me back. To them, the scandal is manageable now that Thorne is exposed. But their opinion doesn't matter. Only yours does. If you want me to walk away, To disappear from public life entirely. I will sign this right now, and it's done. If you want me to stay, to rebuild the company and secure a legacy for our child, I will do that. The power is yours, Isabella. I am surrendering it to you completely. You will decide my future. Isabella looked from the folder to the resignation letter and finally back to his face. She saw no manipulation there, only the raw, desolate landscape of a man who had finally understood the totality of his failure. Power is what broke you, Julian, she said softly. The fear of losing it, the arrogance of having it. I don't want that power. She pushed the resignation letter back towards him. A legacy for our child needs a father, not a ghost. Rebuild it, but rebuild it as a better man. She took a deep breath. I'm using some of the funds to start a foundation. I'm calling it the Nightingale Foundation. It will provide legal and psychological support for victims of complex harassment and reputational attacks. I'm taking the ugliest thing that ever happened to me, and I'm turning it into a shield for other people. He could only nod, overwhelmed by her strength and grace. But you cannot come home, she said, her voice gaining a new firmness. It was the final condition, the one that mattered most. Not now, maybe not for a very long time. I need to feel safe. Our child needs to be born into a house of peace, not a house of ghosts. I need to heal. And you are broken, Julian. You need to fix yourself. Not for me, for you. You will seek intensive therapy. You will excavate every dark, insecure corner of your soul. And you will understand, truly understand, why you are fertile ground for such poison. You will become a man who is stronger than his own pride. Until you are that man, you'll be a visitor in your child's life. A loving, supportive, but distant one. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was a long and lonely exile. It was also just. It was merciful. It was more than he deserved. I will, he vowed, his voice thick with unshed tears. Anything, whatever it takes. A fragile silence settled between them again. This time, Isabella broke it. She stood up and slowly walked towards him. He braced himself, not knowing what to expect. She stopped in front of him, and, with a courage that stunned him, she reached out, took his hand, the same hand that had struck her, and gently placed it flat against her stomach. The warmth of her skin, of the life beneath it, was a shock to his system. And then it happened. A tiny, decisive, living pulse fluttered against his palm. A kick. His breath caught in his throat. A single tear finally escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He looked from his hand on her belly to her face. A faint, watery smile touched her lips, a mirror of his own. It was not a smile of joy or forgiveness, but one of shared, profound, and heartbreaking humanity. It was the first light after a long and terrible storm. 2 years later, the gardens of their home in the Cotswolds were filled not with reporters, but with the quiet laughter of close friends and family. A small white tent was set up on the lawn, decorated with simple wildflowers. It was their son, Arthur's, first birthday. Julian stood by the cake table, not as the imperious host, but as a man quietly observing the happiness around him. He was leaner, the harsh edges of his ambition softened by something quieter, more thoughtful. He had kept his promise. 2 years of intense therapy, of rebuilding his company with humility instead of hubris, and of being a devoted, if initially distant, father. Isabella, now the respected founder of the Nightingale Foundation, moved through the party with an easy grace. She was radiant, not with the gloss of a billionaire's wife, but with the inner light of a woman who had found her own power. She walked over to Julian, handing him a small plate with a slice of cake. "He's having the time of his life," she said, nodding towards their son, who was happily mashing frosting into his hair. Julian smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his eyes. "He gets that from you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their child. The chasm that had opened between them and the conservatory at Kew Gardens had not vanished, but they had spent 2 years building a bridge across it. One difficult conversation, one act of trust, one shared moment of parenthood at a time. "I saw the news about the Foundation's new initiative," he said. "It's incredible, ISA. What you've built." "I learned from the best," she replied, her gaze soft. but I'm trying to do it a little differently." He knew what she meant. He looked from their son back to her, his heart full of a quiet, painful hope. "Isabella," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "is it time?" She didn't pretend to misunderstand. She looked at the man he had become, a man who showed up, who listened, who had done the work. The man who had finally learned that his greatest strength was not in his invulnerability, but in his willingness to be vulnerable with her. She reached out and gently brushed a stray crumb from his cheek. A slow, genuine smile, the kind he thought he might never see directed at him again, spread across her face. "Yes, Julian," she said, "I think it's time for you to come home." The story of Julian and Isabella is a testament to the fact that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that true strength is found not in power, but in vulnerability and the hard work of redemption. Their journey reminds us that happy endings aren't just found, they're forged. If their story of love, loss, and recovery moved you, please show your support by hitting the like button, sharing this video with someone who loves a powerful drama, and subscribing to our channel for more tales that delve into the complexities of the human heart. Thank you for listening.